more special ed teachers.
Andy? Hey, hi, good morning. Can you hear me? I might have to zip off. My son had a hearing aid emergency and he might have to like call me from the audiologist office. I just want you guys know if I disappear, okay?
Thank you.
Okay.
Best of luck with your son.
I just hope I don't have to buy new hearing aids.
Okay, we'll call this meeting of the task force to order, 9:30. Michelle, do you have some opening remarks?
Well, I think you probably have more details than I do on the status of the press conference and the release of the findings report. I'm not quite where that stands at this point.
Or have exactly the same information. The committee leadership has been trying to schedule it. It turned out that there were some dates later in the month, and the most recent information we got is that the Senate chair is unavailable the second half of the month, perhaps recovering from his primary. So I don't know when it's going to be scheduled or whether we're going to do it with or without him. And the problem is that we've been not publicly releasing it until it was released at that press conference. And if we're moving now towards these public meetings in September, we need it out. So we continue, to discuss that. So I don't know anything about that. I mean, I do think that we have three sort of immediate action items. One is the release of a report and those rest-based meetings, and at least I'm skipping ahead in the agenda here, and at least on that, Tiffany argued that we ought to have at least one in a place like New Haven, where folks who cannot make it to the rest and who are clearly involved in the special ed process could participate. So that's one issue. The second issue is that the message we got from Chairman Curry at the last meeting was that he wanted us to cover every major topic in special ed, even when we can't reach agreement. And the question is, should we do that? Do we have time? How do we respond to that? And the third issue is, what we really got to establish a process for coming up with specific recommendations. We're doing this sort of work justifying those recommendations all in a matter of 3 months. So those are all items on today's agenda. The big highlight of the featured presentation today Ms. Lisa, telling us how special ed is funded in Connecticut and how it should be funded. So if you have nothing further,
Yeah, I just want to thank Lisa for stepping up to the plate on this at the very, very last minute. I understand that this sort of was sprung on you and I so appreciate you being willing to speak to it and just understand that this is like the beginning of a conversation. Thank you.
You're welcome. So please bear with me. I put this slide deck together yesterday, so hopefully it'll flow hopefully for this conversation and really hit the point that everybody is looking to hit to start talking about special education funding. So I just sent it to Rosie, and
yes.
I'm wondering, Rosie, will you be transitioning from slide to slide? So do you want me to say next slide? I'm guessing that she is control.
Yeah, just tell me next slide.
Okay, perfect. All right, so let's get started. Next slide, Rosie. All right, this is just my contact information that was on the previous slide, and I'll send this to the task force after this meeting, so that if you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Next slide, Rosie. For those of you who don't know our organization, we are a nonprofit organization that was established in 2015. Essentially, we take data that is publicly available from the State Department of Education and we analyze the information. All of the data that we present is factual. We don't modify or skew the information to further our agenda. But we are a policy organization that is very focused on increasing equitable funding in the state of Connecticut. And when you have a K-12 education system that is so reliant on local property taxes, you obviously have a education funding system that is inequitable from the start. And so we do advance legislative proposals and work with the General Assembly to try to increase equity in the K-12 education space. But we also strive to be a trusted resource, not just to policymakers, but to other stakeholders. We work collaboratively with superintendents and board of education members to just try to increase knowledge and transparency of K-12 education funding. And so that is essentially our organization. We do have a fantastic community engagement director. She does have some thoughts actually on the accumulation of public input, so I'll have her write it down and I'll send it along to all of you. But we do have a community engagement team that also go to work with parents to increase knowledge and to increase civic participation. We even will sign up an individual who might be opposed to our policy. We help them sign up to testify. We let them know when their name is coming up. So we just try to incentivize public participation in what is a very complex process. Next slide, Rosie.
Oh, Lisa.
Yeah.
I hope you don't mind being interrupted.
No, sure.
Are you part of a national organization somehow?
No, we were established to work squarely in the state of Connecticut. We do engage with fee for service opportunities when we have somebody across the nation who's interested in, for example, we've done enrollment projections for Indianapolis Public Schools when they had a change in their school footprint, or they had to propose. I think ultimately not a lot of it was adopted. But our organization will step in and make recommendations and help them, understand the impact of decisions that those leaders are making. So we do engage with various public school districts and states across the country. We recently worked with Colorado State Department of Education, for example. They wanted to understand points in their funding system that increase inequities in their funding system. And so we did do that analysis, and they actually just had a significant overhaul of their K-12 funding system in Colorado. So no, we do work. Those are limited fee for service engagements, but we primarily are focused on Connecticut.
Okay.
So across the state, $13.3 billion is spent on K-12 education. As you can see, the primary source of that funding does come from local property taxes at 56.5%. I will say that the state has made tremendous gains over, since 2017, when it enacted the new education cost sharing formula. And the reliance on local sources is reducing, that the state has picked up a larger share. But that still only went from 60% to 56.5%. So while the state is picking up more, we are still very reliant on local property taxes here in the state of Connecticut.
Is that 4.7, is that all ECS or is there other money in that?
That's actually the next slide, or the next slide. Rosie, if you can go to the next slide, please. Yeah. So this shows state funding by grant source. As you can see, ECS is the largest piece of state funding to support K-12 education. And the education cost sharing grant is provided directly to local public school districts. So we'll get into the education cost sharing grant in greater detail, but there are other state support for K-12 education. This pie shows this breakdown. Good morning. And so you have like magnet school support, charter school support, for example. Alliance district grants are not a separate grant. Those are grants that are supposed to target low performing districts. We recently learned that it only is provided to Alliance district, or excuse me, to low performing districts that have greater than 1,000 students, which is a little bit concerning to us because you have some very low performing districts that are not getting the protection that the Alliance district grant provides. But essentially the Alliance district grant is a part of ECS funding. And districts have to submit a plan, they have to get approval from the State Department of Education, and then that money goes directly to the Board of Education. But it's a part of ECS, it's not new or increased support. Next slide, Rosie.
Well, back on that. Well, there's that list on the right, which I can't read.
Yeah.
Can you read down that list of what the other sources of funding are?
School building projects, magnet schools, excess costs, which we'll get into a little bit more later. Charter schools, both techs, which are 100% state operated and state funded. Chef transportation, priority school districts, and then other grants that we compile together that are less than $40 million. So when you look at the state budget, you'll see all of these different grants broken out. And I will say that as the state has created new types of public schools or new types of programs, they always establish them with their own separate line item and their own separate methodology for distributing those funds. The education cost sharing grant, which was recently modified in 2017 and the state started to use it in 2019. That is the first that's like formulaically distributed based on student need. So special education specifically, Connecticut is one of few states, and when I say one of few, I say we are very unique in that the state does not provide any support for special education until the expenses get up to what is really a catastrophic level. And so Connecticut's public schools primarily receive support for students with disabilities through the education cost sharing grant. So as you can imagine, if and the excess cost grant is calculated off of net current expenditures per pupil, and this is a calculation that the State Department of Education annually publishes, and it takes the per pupil expenditure, and districts have to spend up until you get to 4.5 times, all through local property taxes, like once the education cost sharing grant is exceeded, all the way up to the 4.5 times in order to get some percentage of reimbursement from the state. So that is a lot of expenditure that is being borne by local property taxes. I didn't provide all of this detail here, although we do have information that speaks to the fact that you have higher concentrations of students with disabilities or higher concentrations of students with any additional needs concentrated in our primarily urban areas that have low property values. So we have concentrations of high need students in districts that have the least amount of ability to pay for all of those services. And so the excess cost grant, the legislature did increase the appropriation to support excess costs by $20 million a year. They thought that that was going to be near full funding. It was nowhere near full funding. And so when claims came in, because it's a reimbursement program through a current year, when reimbursements came in, they were far in excess of what the total funding was. And so in 2024, the excess cost grant was not fully funded to the tune of almost $80 million. And so districts, obviously didn't get the reimbursements that they had anticipated, and we now have a grant that is, pretty far from full funding. Rosie, can you go to the next slide?
Can I just ask a question? I mean, we might be getting to this, and I apologize if you are. Do you know how many years of sort of track record we have on excess cost reimbursement? Tracking the amount that is the deficit
I
that
have
is
that.
not covered by the excess cost grant.
Sure. So I don't have that in this,
Okay.
but we do have, a tally, and I'll just take notes. A tally of what the appropriation is as compared to claims, and then
Right.
what the delta was to full funding.
And the last year of full funding was 12, right? 2012, is that right, Lisa?
It could be, I don't want
I believe
to
that's-
speak
I
without
believe that's
knowing.
correct.
I think there was a comment made, I might have misheard it, but at the last meeting about we don't know how to budget it because we don't understand what the claims are going to be year to year. So that's what I'm trying to figure out. Like, do we know what the claims will be year to year?
So when we dug into the underfunding in 24, and what we found was that the number of claims in terms of the number of students didn't go up. So it's not like we had, and these are largely outplacements, largely, right? Because you're getting up to like very high cost. Largely kids that are placed and outplaced in private providers because they can't be educated within their own district. And so we found that the number of students were approximately level. It was the cost of the same population or a relative same population that had exceeded. And when you have a program that is based on current year reimbursements, it's very hard to estimate how much the cost of full funding is going to be. The legislature really thought that adding that $20 million was gonna get close to full funding to the tiers that we'll talk about in the next slide.
Okay.
But they thought that they were getting close to the tiered full funding, and it just was wildly inaccurate. And the General Assembly didn't add more money for this current school or the upcoming school year. So it's likely if the claims continue how they were, it'll likely be the underfunding approximately the same amount.
Lisa, I have a question when you're presenting this information, because sometimes I think people feel that you get full reimbursement for a student, and that's not true.
Oh, no.
So that's what I'm saying, like in the explanation, so that people understand that piece, that you're not getting full reimbursement for tuition.
That's
It's just
right.
a percentage of the difference.
That's right. So the local property taxes is paying, and the local district is paying all the way up to that 4.5 times, but then once they get to 4.5 times, they're not getting 100% above
No,
the 4.5 times. And so on the next slide, what we show is a few years ago and previously, the excess cost grant was not distributed in an equitable way. It was every district received the same percentage of state support regardless of municipal ability to pay or municipal level. And so Senator Looney, I don't remember the year exactly, it could have been 2021, but Senator Looney, who is a senator that's, very focused on equitable distribution of state resources, he led the charge to change the state's reimbursement under the excess cost grant. And they first started it, as you can see with that column, that's prior law. They started it with those percentage reimbursements. They recently changed it to increase so that our most property for municipalities in terms of their equalized net grand list, they were supposed to receive 91% of total claims from the state. And as you can see, even districts in the wealthiest tier were supposed to receive 85%, which was greater than what the state was previously receiving, which was 70%. So they increased everybody, and they did add an equity metric to provide more resources to our most high need communities in terms of property wealth. But unfortunately, they didn't get up to full funding, and as a result, all of the grants were reduced and districts were reimbursed ranging from 64% to 75%. So, definitely underfunding, and districts that are captured in that wealthiest tier actually receive less than what the state was previously providing, which was in the 70% range. But we do have, we did put together, because we did receive this question before about how much the excess cost grant was underfunded through time. So I'll follow that up to the task force along with the last date of full funding.
Oh, I want to make 4 additional points.
Hmm?
I want to make 4 additional points.
Okay.
One, lower districts that have a lower per pupil get reimbursement at a lower 4.5 times. And so even without this tier, it wasn't exactly equal among districts. The reimbursement of opportunities for a low per pupil expenditure district were much greater than for a higher per pupil district. So that already existed.
Yeah.
2, these excess costs available both for in-district programs and out-of-district programs. I got data from the Department of Education, which showed that 91% of the money goes to out-of-district programs historically. 3, this is money paid in arrears. And so I believe there are 2 payments of excess costs to districts, but it's one when the year is halfway through and one in the spring. And so to the extent that, and it's that year money, so it has to be spent in that. So, maybe that may be a real, something that causes some pain to districts. And 4, the way this was designed, the money goes back to the municipality, not to the school district. Now, in a lot of districts, there's an arrangement where it automatically passes through. That's not true generally. I asked the author of the original legislation about that, and he said that going to the municipality was necessary to get votes for passage in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, we do talk to various stakeholders across the state, and it is treated differently depending on which municipality that you're in. Some municipalities, and I will not say not majority, but they do provide those resources from this reimbursement back to their Board of Education. But in a lot of municipalities, because in their view, they budgeted the money to support that these resources are due back.
Let me ask you,
It is treated differently.
I want to explore that issue particularly, because I really don't understand it. So, the Board of Education gets an appropriation from the municipality, right? Passed by the board, passed by the town council or board of finance, whatever, and they get X dollars. And so if there's excess cost reimbursement, does those X dollars go up, or do those X dollars just stay the same and it just offsets other money? I mean, that's,
I think both. And I think Patrice can probably speak to this a little bit more, but I think that, there's the possibility that a town could provide supplemental resources.
Right, there are
If it's
cases where-
extreme, like,
Right, if there are cases where a Board of Education has to go back to the municipality and say, we have extraordinary, special ed costs. We need an additional appropriation. Sometimes the municipality will say, okay, we understand, and other times they'll say, you figure it out.
and that's entirely independent though of excess cost reimbursement.
Absolutely.
yeah,
So so excess cost reimbursement, I mean, so the Board of Education in a mythical town gets, it's appropriated $100 million in a year. And so the town gets some excess cost reimbursement. That $100 million does not go up necessarily.
No, but the excess cost is still not fully covering by any stretch of the imagination, the costs that have been incurred.
Absolutely, it's not.
So,
But there is a check that's coming from the state for X dollars, and
There is.
and it should not affect the appropriation to the Board of Education, except if the town council decides to increase it.
The rationale that I've heard most frequently about this, and I think this is consistent with your comments, Lisa, about it being necessary to passage, was that this was intended to cover unbudgeted expenditures. So when the Board of Education submits its budget at the beginning of the fiscal year, theoretically, it is budgeting for the expenditures, including high-need special education students. So if there is money that is reimbursed against those budgeted expenditures, right, that should come back to the municipality.
That is what a municipal leader has said in the past. Yeah.
Are you gonna talk at all, Lisa, about how special ed was previously funded when it was the sliding scale reimbursement before it was quote unquote folded into ECS?
I was gonna just hit on the fact that.
We did have a
ECS
different
is
system.
supposed to cover
Yeah.
some special ed, but it's not, it's just for accounting purposes only.
Yeah.
But if you would like to talk about that briefly.
Well, in 30 seconds, before ECS was created, special ed expenditures were reimbursed on a sliding scale from 20 to, I believe it was 60%. I don't think it was ever 80. And it based on the wealth of the district. So there was some attempt to have equity built into that. And districts had to submit their accounting of special ed separately from other expenditures. And then the theory was that it was incorporated into ECS so that there wouldn't be the need for this separate grant and the separate accounting. The problem, of course, was that the foundation level was set to accommodate those costs at the moment that ECS was created. That foundation, the creators of the ECS formula, I confess my husband worked on the project.
Dinner time conversation.
It was designed to dinner conversation every single night for 2 years. It was designed that the foundation would rise as the cost of educating an average student in an average town, which was what the foundation was supposed to reflect, increased. Of course, the legislature froze the foundation for far too many years, and the formula therefore never reflected those actual costs, including the rising special ed costs.
And on that topic, I mean, that's another model for funding. And every state in the union has a different model for funding special education. And I'll ask Lisa the question again. Do we have any evidence that anybody's model is better?
No, because they all do it differently. And I looked this up yesterday, 39 states provide some level of state support for special education generally, so prior to getting to the excess cost level of reimbursement, and they do it differently. Some do a flat weight, if you have a weighted funding formula like the state of Connecticut has. Some have varying rates depending on the student and the level of need for each individual student. And some just have a flat per pupil grant support. So I haven't seen any academic research that states that this one type of funding model is better than this other type of funding model. I just know that Connecticut is an outlier in the fact that we don't provide any resources until you get to excess cost. I also fully appreciate the fact that the General Assembly enacting an ECS formula to begin with was an incredibly strong political feat. I mean, we had conditions that were very unique in the state of Connecticut, and the fact that you had a General Assembly that enacted this formula and that they faithfully followed it since it was enacted, I think says a lot. And so, you know, from getting something passed and trying to actually effectually change so that the state starts to support special education, you know, in my personal opinion, I think it's easiest to do that through this formula that the General Assembly has supported and has followed since it's been enacted.
Well, the matrix that for relevant for us is there are a state where special ed is better funded, it's more fully funded, and we don't have
Is
any.
there? Sure. I mean, most states provide resources, so I would say that most states are doing better than the state of Connecticut in the fact that they're at least providing something. I mean, something's better than nothing.
Are we the only state that only has an excess cost reimbursement?
Why don't we hear enough about, like, I just feel like that should be the headline. That seems
Well,
so wild.
yeah, but I mean, that sort of begs the question. I mean, from the point of view of the special ed director, is the special ed director, in Indianapolis in better shape than the special ed director in New Haven? And, we don't, we have no way to measure that.
Don't tell me. I don't think.
I think that in order to answer that question, though, you would need to also analyze the regular or the support for students or just the general state support for education. You can't just look at one.
Oh, I think it'd be a very taxing project to look at that. And, that's not something we have the capability of doing. And so making substantial recommendations in this area, we lack the data to support it.
And I wonder, Lisa, if you have any information too about even looking at our percentage compared to other states and whether or not there's money that's invested, even prior to identification. Because if you start looking at our trajectory and how we've been at a steep increase in the number of students that we've been identifying, I'm wondering whether or not some of the other states and how much money, not just when a child is identified, but even looking at that through this whole pre-referral process and how states are addressing that. I think it would be of some interest as well.
I have never seen them, but I think that you're right. So there's a lot of national education policy organizations and they compile how other states are funding their K-12 education system. And I've never seen that data point.
It'd be hard to define. There's so much could go into what that is, but that is what we want to see is investing in things at the front end. Obvious point being that you might not get to the point where you need kind of that tier 3.
Yeah.
Well, and then the other issue is that some states do not limit money to being spent in the year that's appropriated for it. It allows carryover, and that allows for investment in bigger projects that might have a payoff in the future.
We have carry.
Very limited.
Well,
Very.
it's still a 2-year grant. So it's still a carryover, even though it's only 20% that you can technically over.
What did you proceed, Lisa?
I'm just thinking. Okay, so excess cost. Rosie, would you mind going to the next slide? Oh, so this gets to the point that Patrice was making. In the 90s, the state of Connecticut decided that they were going to roll special education into the ECS grant, and they increased the foundation by $911 on the books, according to the feds. The state claims that 20 to 25% of ECS funding is used to support IDEA funding requirements. However, as we know, that foundation, like Patrice mentioned, has not been adjusted since the 90s. And at its base, the foundation is supposed to represent the cost to educate a student without any additional learning needs. And so
So what is that based on? Like, when they say it's 20 to 25% of ECS funding is assumed to be attributed to special education expenditures, what is that assumption based on at this point?
I believe that when they rolled it into ECS, the amount of funding at the time that they rolled in was 20 or 25% of the grant. And so they just therefore still use those percentages as their maintenance of effort requirement to the federal government. And they just use when ECS goes up year after year, which it has because we've been faithfully following this new formula. That same percentage is provided to the Fed as the maintenance effort. So there is some claim that the state does provide funding through the ECS formula for special education services. I would argue that that is a false claim, but that is me. I think that the State Department of Education would claim otherwise.
And what is the foundation level right now?
So $11,525. And we'll go into the details of the ECS formula next, just so.
Thank you. Because I'm just wondering, Lisa, and maybe you're gonna get to it, and this is not for every town, but certainly for places like New Haven, who have to pay for charter school and how that's not goes into any ECS funding or anything.
Yeah, so I have some slides in a bit that speak to how
Okay.
other types of
Oh,
public schools
good,
are funded. But the way that Connecticut funds public schools generally is very complex, so like I'm presenting it and trying to be as transparent as possible as I can with a very complex system.
Yeah.
But you will all appreciate how complex it is when we get to our infographics that are coming up. Thank you. Okay, next slide, Rosie. Okay, so ECS, we're just gonna talk about ECS. As I mentioned, it's to support local and therefore regional public schools. Next slide, Rosie. We have it because of the Horton v. Mescal Supreme Court decision, which ruled that at the time in the 70s, the state was just providing the same per pupil grant for every public school student, regardless of the town in which they resided. And the court ruled that this was violated the children's constitutional rights for an equal education, because we have very property wealthy towns that can spend more on K-12 education with less effort. So at the time, the state established a formula. It was the new ECS formula, and it's supposed to capture how much the community can afford versus how much the total cost is, and therefore what the state support should be. I don't know, Patrice, how long your husband was involved, but the state followed this formula for a period of time, and then it stopped, and it started using block grants for a number of years. So while we had a formula on the books, I think throughout, they not withstood it, the General Assembly not withstood it, and just funded districts via a block grant until 2017, when they enacted a new formula.
When did the block grants start?
In the 90s.
After his time, and
After
nothing to do with it.
In the 90s. Because you had a formula and it dictated that you should be spending a certain amount, and in order to achieve, I think, state savings, they just funded every district at level funding from where they were previously. And so by 2017, I mentioned this like unique environment that was going on, but you had the CEJA case that was before the court. And while the ultimate ruling was struck down, you also had Governor Malloy at the time that was really seeking to change the state's distribution of resources through the ECS formula. He was proposing to zero out some communities. And you had the state had a split Senate at the time. And so there was just a lot of factors at the time. We didn't have a budget until October. And the new education cost sharing formula that the state is still following today was enacted at that time. And it was originally enacted with a 10-year phase-in. It was opposed to an anticipated cost at that time, like an extra $390 million. The state was facing budget deficit after budget deficit, and so they decided to phase it in over 10 years. And so we have this formula in place. Next slide, Rosie.
Do we know how far behind we are compared to where we should be had the foundation kept up over that period of time?
No, but that's interesting. One of the long-term policy objectives that we are focused on with the School District Finance Project is adjusting that foundation, at least for inflation, because there is not, I don't think, consensus that 11,525 is even the right basis of support. Clearly, it's been in place since the 90s. It's not, but I have not seen academic research, and I wish that there was, because it would make our lives a lot easier, that would state to what that number should be.
Seems like that's a number we need to know. I think so.
I would agree, and that's not number that academic research, I mean, like, we can put out a number, but it wouldn't be based on anything that is like actual. It would be great if there was academic research that spoke to what that number should be, but I haven't seen it. And so as an organization, when we're trying to at least just incrementally change and increase equity and increase state support for K-12 education, we know that that number is not realistic. It's been in place for so long. At the very least, the state should be indexing it for inflation like it does other metrics, which would, and we've estimated the cost, and I can provide that to the task force as well. The cost is significant because it is the base of the formula. And it would increase state support dramatically year after year.
Is it dollar for dollar that if you increase the foundation amount by $1, that the total appropriation for ECS would go up $1 times the number of students?
No, because of how the formula shakes out with taking into account
Right.
student need and then the base aid ratio to distribute the state local share. So this is how ECS funding flows. It flows from the state to the town, city hall, and then over to the school district. As we mentioned, foundation is supposed to represent the class-educated child without additional learning needs. It's established in statute, and it's currently, it has been 11,525. Next slide, Rosie. So then the formula, the new formula took, I think, a very important step forward. Many states also provide student-based weights, and the foundation, or excuse me, the formula takes into account the needs of each school district's student population. And so therefore, for every low-income student, there is a weight of 30%. When you have concentrated poverty, which means that your school district is 60%, students that are economically disadvantaged, the district then gets an additional bump in terms of total need support of 15% above that 60% threshold. And then multilingual learners have a weight of 25%.
Is that additive?
Yes, so the next chart will show
Is it-
cumulatively what that means.
Is that evidence-based in any way, or are those just numbers that some legislator decided made sense?
Those are just numbers. But
Okay,
I will say that there were more recent adjustments in like 2021 to change the weight. So the concentrated poverty weight increased from 5% to 15%, and the multilingual learner weight increased from 15 to 25%. So every state has different percentages, every state has a different base. And as I mentioned, the academic research does not point to, or has not pointed to numbers that, or percentages that should be used that are appropriate
Yeah,
and
those-
do cover the cost.
the reason for my question is, if we're going to be in the business of proposing a special ed weight, do we need an evidence base for it? And if there's no evidence base for these three, I guess the answer is no.
You'd be surprised.
And so like when we have estimated the cost of a special education weight, we have used the 25%. Although it could be any percentage, you could seek any percentage for additional state support. Rosie, can you go to the next slide, please? So this shows the cumulative impact of this. If you are a concentrated low-income student, the estimated cost to educate you is $16,711. Whereas if you are a student that resides in concentrated poverty and you're a multilingual learner, as you see, the estimated cost to educate that student jumps up to $19,552.
So if we were to ask the State Department of Education where these numbers came from, where these percentages came from, are we saying that they would not be able to provide any particular support for these numbers?
Any justification for the percentages
Yeah.
used? I think that they would respond simply that it was legislatively designated. And I was employed in the General Assembly when this formula was negotiated, and I helped to negotiate this formula, and I can tell you that there's no justification for the percentages used. It was just, I think, best efforts to try and capture additional need associated with students that have additional needs, and therefore just trying to provide more support for those needs. And so if you go to the appropriations co-chair, Tony Walker, and you say to her, I think multilingual learner, instead of being 25%, should be 30%. I think that she would say, okay, let's have a conversation about that and why you think that. And there would be that conversation because there, at the time, there was never like a strong data source that pointed to these percentages being the ones that are appropriate.
Do we know what the true number for just the general education non-need student should be?
No.
Or a guess of the average, what is the average cost of the average school in Connecticut per student? And I would imagine is significantly higher. And if that number were fixed,
And
the
that seems
formula
like
would
the
be
root of
fine.
everything.
That's.
It seems like the root of it.
I feel like if we change the percentages, we just kick the can down the road and give somebody else the problem with another 5, 10 years.
Well, two things to say. One, the average per pupil is around 20 now. Around
But-
20,000.
But the ARPA money has skewed a lot.
Well, that's true. There's no.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a way to look at. that.
And then the other thing is to sort of conject, sort of the street wisdom is that it costs almost twice as much to educate a special ed student on average as it does to educate a general ed student, which would mean the weight should be 100% if it were evidence-based, right?
I hear your question, and we'll do some noodling. If there's a way to kind of tease that out.
Just to come up with that, without being evidence-based, what could it or should it have been, and would that bring us back towards maybe being closer to being fully funded? If that's the answer, that's a good recommendation.
No, not at all. Okay, next slide, Rosie.
Oh, wait a second. I have a quick, this is Susan. Hi. If for some reason you could get the formula, the weighted formula change to include special education, would it then be broken down into the same categories, but it would say special education and low income student, special education and and English learner? Is that how then the categories would be broken down?
Those weights are cumulative, Susan, so it wouldn't just be a new weight that would then increase the estimated cost funding per student. And then it would be broken out, that total cost per district would then be split between state and local resources. So it would, if you are a student and the economically disadvantaged data point that is used is qualifying for free and reduced price lunch. So if you are a student that qualifies for free and reduced price lunch, plus you're a multilingual learner, plus you receive special education services, that would all be cumulative in terms of your estimated total need.
Lisa, this is Jason. I do have a question to follow up on that, because no matter what we do with the formula, if the state doesn't meet its obligations, and so I'm confused what the law that we introduced several slides ago even means if it doesn't have any teeth in it. So if they can just say, oh, well, we passed a law that says it's 91% reimbursement for these districts, and then they don't do it, is there any penalty? Does money get from the rainy day fund? Does that have to get diverted to that first? Is there any teeth in that law?
So that's a good question. The excess cost statute specifically says that the appropriation is within available resources. So that allows the General Assembly to appropriate any amount, and then the grants are prorated accordingly depending on the amount of appropriation that is made to support them. The ECS formula, as I mentioned, it has been faithfully followed, meaning that the General Assembly has appropriated the estimated cost to fully fund according to where we are in the phase-in process, the ECS grant. Is there the possibility that in the future, the General Assembly will say, well, never mind? Sure. But that is, I think, a problem that every appropriation has across the entire state budget, and why it's important for stakeholders to be vocal in reinforcing the need to fully fund these grants. With the excess
That was the question, Lisa, that right now the priority seems to be, and granted, as an educator, I'm happy that they're trying to pay the retirement that we need, but so there's no language in this that there's always going to be an estimate, and that's the problem with the system, but there's nothing that says any catch-up money has to come first before we put it in the rainy day fund or something like that.
No.
Okay.
I do have just want to everybody to think about it. We've been talking about over-identification of special ed students. If we add the special ed category, I wonder if that offers an opportunity for even more, for over-identification of special ed students. There becomes then an incentive for a district to have more special ed students than less. So I do wonder if that creates another issue. Not that it may solve one and create another, it's just my thought.
That argument has been made in the past, about various possibilities of acknowledging special ed, students and the extra costs. Since districts have never been reimbursed 100% for their special ed expenditures, I have never met a superintendent that would say, let's have more special ed kids identified so that we'll get more money. But whatever they're getting is going to be only a portion of their total cost.
And the teams making the decisions are so far removed from that consideration. I really don't anticipate that that would drive decision making.
Sometimes.
But it is an argument that has been made.
Yeah, I just wonder, because I'm a math teacher, so I'm seeing how the formula might work and change. I just know that one of the things we're talking about was, were we over-identifying or under-identifying special ed? Was that an issue over the past year?
Well, I'll also say that more than half the states have a per special ed student
Yeah.
appropriation for special education. And so, that issue, if it exists, is pretty widespread. I mean, it's.
The other thing, I'm just wondering too, because of the fact that districts, we are, again, in theory, there are some students that we could technically educate in district, but there's really no money appropriated to districts there's no incentive to have specialized programs. And if you do, it's really on the back of your own district and being able to provide those kinds of things. So it becomes a challenge because right now we don't have a lot of these programs that are out there and available for students. And even the ones that could, potentially have us, have students qualify for excess cost, and you don't have enough money in district to create them. So it becomes a challenge on either way. There's
And,
nothing built in.
And let's hold that, because I think that's another area of recommendation. What we can do to recommend something that can actually help districts build capacity and educate more students in districts.
That came up a lot last meeting too about, and I know that the legislature appears to be interested in
Yeah, I
in
mean,
incentivizing the creation and kind of at least providing seed money, if not sustainable.
I'll be honest with you, I talked to Sue Weisler, she told me to get in contact with you, because really, right now I have a whole proposal for a whole alternative school, need $1.2 million, not coming.
And, okay, so I mean, we
Yes.
So you
can
can
For
recommend.
capital.
I think we will be developing a
It is for
recommendation
capital.
that way.
I will help you.
Yes, please, I need 1.2. I have the whole proposal, I give it.
The money went back to the school district instead of the municipality. That might actually give you the 1.2.
Honestly.
And I wish that Mike Rome was here because, Meriden did a lot to build a much more robust system in district. And I know that there was some upfront costs. But that's something else. I mean, outside of the operating side, definitely can recommend, that person can recommend capital funding.
He talked a little bit about it last
Yeah.
meeting.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Sorry, hi, this is Susan. Lisa, because I know not all states have this excess cost grant. Are there any states that we can look at how that includes special education as a section, and how they figure out their formulas?
Yeah, so there are national K-12 education policy organizations that compile this kind of information. There's a few different sources, and I'll share it with the task force so that you all can take a look and make it. Okay. Okay, so the formula, number of students, the needs of the students, total cost to educate your population. The formula then says, okay, we're gonna take that total cost by district and we're gonna split it between the state and local share. And they do that with two income metrics. One is the equalized net grand list of the town, which is weighted at 70%, and then income wealth, which is median household income. So you take that total cost, you split it between state and local share using the Bayes ratio. Next slide, Rosie. The formula then says, okay, we have some towns that have just significant need, and the formula takes into consideration the Public Investment Communities Index score. This is a ranking and a scoring that the Office of Policy Management does every year. The PIC index is a more holistic view of a town and the level of need within the town. And it takes into such things like the median household income and the equalized net grand list, but it also takes into account like unemployment rate and tenant benefits within the town. It has a number of different factors, so really a more holistic view. The formula then provides the 19 highest PIC index scored communities with additional base aid points. So and number one is Hartford. If you are Hartford and the formula says that you should receive 70% of your total funding from the state, the formula actually provides 76% because of this additional boost to the PIC index score. So that's additional funding to 19 high need communities in the state of Connecticut. Next slide, Rosie. Every year, this grant is recalculated, and it's based off of the prior year. So really, when you go into a school year, it's based off of the prior academic year. They do shore up in the last payment, but your estimates should be pretty good. And all of these factors obviously go into a district's grant every single year. So because it's a formula, it's updated every year and it's gonna fluctuate, especially when we get to full funding. Districts will see changes in their grants year after year. Next slide, Rosie. So as I mentioned, when the formula was first enacted, it was established in a 10-year phase-in schedule. Thanks to a lot of the great work of people in this room, like Kat and Kate, we managed to increase or accelerate the phase-in. And so now the phase-in, instead of being fully phased in fiscal year 2026, or excuse me, in fiscal year 2028, districts will be fully funded that are considered underfunded according to the formula in fiscal year 2026, so 2 years sooner. The General Assembly did provide the largest year-over-year increase actually between last year and this year. So districts are receiving a larger percentage of full funding in this current or school year. So therefore, districts are getting closer to full funding as a result of a significant investment the General Assembly just made with $150 million. We do have towns that are considered overfunded to the formula. I know Fran, she was here, she hates that term, and I'm sure that's pretty sensitive.
Yeah.
But when the formula was enacted, and remember, we were moving away from just flat funding districts actually using a formula, there were some districts that were considered overfunded because they were receiving a block grant that was larger than what the formula said that they should be receiving. And so the General Assembly said, we don't want districts to take this reduction all at once, and we're going to phase it out so that there will be gradual reductions in total state support. And they did that over a 10-year process as well. And that has been held harmless actually for the past two bienniums. So as a result, all of those districts that are considered overfunded are just receiving, once again, block grants, which is not ideal. However, there are arguments that the state should not be reducing the support for local public school districts, or that those local public school districts should be receiving more. The statute says that they should be receiving reductions. It has been paused for 4 years now, and statutorily in fiscal year 2026, it's supposed to, that phase out is supposed to continue.
What is the current delta between current funding and full funding, UCS?
I don't know the exact number to get to full funding in fiscal year 2026, but I will say that underfunded, because we look at that number along with other changes in the ECS grant, like continuing the phase out for overfunded districts. I will say that underfunded districts are approximately 96% to full funding now in this year. So we're very close to full funding, and the delta to get to full funding next year, if that's your question, is pretty small.
Well, give me a number. It was
I
four.
would like to follow up because I don't.
It's
want
4% to 4 million. Would that be about right?
No,
No.
it's not that simple. It's not just $1 million for each percentage, and I don't want to speak out of term without having the exact
She's a
number.
precise
I will
person.
get back to you.
She does things the right way.
It's a highly charged question, obviously.
And then I think the estimate to get to, or the amount to get to, continue the phase out for overfunded towns is like in the $8 or $9 million range. It's not, it's incredibly large, but yeah, it is politically something that people do not enjoy. So that is the phase in, phase out schedule. And then the next slide, Rosie. This just shows what a per student ECS grant is for various communities across the state using all of the inputs that go into the formula. So I provide this just for illustrative purposes that, you know, Greenwich, their per student ECS grant is only $104 per student. And every district does receive some support under the ECS formula because of a minimum aid ratio that the state has of 1%. But as you can see, our high need, low property wealth districts obviously receive much more in state support than other towns across the state of Connecticut. Okay, thank you, Rosie. So now we're getting into how other types of public school students receive support. There's 10 different funding formulas. Charter schools are the easiest to explain because they just receive state support in terms of general operating support. I will say, and they cannot charge general tuition back to the sending district. I will say that charter schools are statutorily allowed to charge special education expenses back to the sending district. And as do all of the magnet schools and all of the VOAG, every type of public school choice that we have in the state of Connecticut, they can charge special education tuition back to the sending district. Charter school students are therefore pretty easy to explain in terms of the infographic in that they just receive, and all of these infographics just speak to general operating support. They don't speak to the special education tuition billing, which can occur for all of them. Next slide, Rosie. We have one local charter school. It's located in New Haven, and this is how the money flows. Next slide, Rosie. The CTEC system is 100% state funded, and all the CTEC employees are state employees, so they're really an outlier in the system.
And that includes special ed costs.
That's right, yeah. Agri-science, so now we're getting a little bit more complex in terms of tuition. The state provides some resources to the district, or to the town, which provides it to the district. The agri-science operator can charge tuition, and the amount that they can charge tuition is capped in terms of general operating tuition. It's a percentage of the foundation, but they too can charge special education expenses back to the district. And I think we spoke about this previously. The statute says, I think, reasonable cost. The reasonable cost, and does it say actual cost, or
Well, now for the
There's what
state
it-
charters, it says actual cost, which is problematic. So sorry, I'm not feeling happy about that.
So the statute doesn't say that though, but the
The
state
state,
department.
the
or
statute
state board,
doesn't say,
yeah.
you're right, the state board said
State
that. Yes, you're right. The state
Um,
board says it.
So this is agri-science. So just as an aside, as you can see, there's that little box in the bottom left-hand side of the slides. For a number of years, we have been working with a broad coalition to change how other types of public schools are funded in the state. By trying to have the state apply the ECS formula to all types of public schools. And then by doing so, the state would be picking up 100% of the general education costs for those types of, for that school of choice. And then therefore local tuition billing would be eliminated. And so that doesn't touch special education, which is a whole nother nightmare in terms of the tuition billing mess that's going on. But we've been trying to work towards having the state pick up more of the cost for general operating costs for our schools of choice. The state did provide that $150 million, which allowed to get closer to full funding under ACS, but also allowed to provide 42% of the state's cost, the total cost to have the ECS formula be applied to all of the other types of students in the state of Connecticut. So all of those boxes are pretty consistent in that we are currently at a place where tuition is capped and where the increase in state support has gone up.
Has there ever been a move to have the state fund the special education costs rather than billing that back to the local district?
I have not known of such an effort, but I think that it would make a lot of the nightmare that we see with special education tuition billing be addressed. I will say that, you know, obviously the state would be then picking up a larger share of total costs, which is difficult to do. But you see, I mean, we all saw Hartford Public Schools and all of their budget deficits that they've been facing year after year after year. And they have been receiving more state support, but they have a lot of kids that exercise choice because they are the hub of the chef agreement, and their tuition bills are outpacing their increase in state support. So just at least eliminating the regular education tuition billing is at least a good step, and having the state pick up on that expense. Our rationale is that if the state created all of these other types of public schools, it should fund those schools and it should fund those students according to their needs. And now that the state has an ACS formula that actually takes into account student needs, it's like it's a clear progression to have the state use that formula to fund them. But it costs money. And there's a lot of different constituencies and interest groups that are all looking to get the same pot of resources. So, yes, I mean, special education, I've not heard of an effort to date, but special education tuition billing causes a lot of friction. Between.
I was just wondering if that had been tried and failed before, so I
That would be a great thing to, you know.
So Lisa, in terms of all these public schools of choice, how many kids are we talking about? What kind of percentage of the whole student body is it?
I will get back to you on that.
None of the agri-science schools are deployments. Chippewa is one where I teach, we're small.
How many?
We have maybe 400 kids in our high school at max. Nanawa's a little bigger. They're probably around 800, I would guess. Housatonic is small. They're a small school. That's another one of them. I don't know all of them, but none of them are huge.
That only
Talking about all
covers-
their science.
Just to have the
That
science.
just
one.
There was there's 20 of them. There are 20 of them.
20 agri-science schools. We're the 20.
Yeah, so I mean,
We're talking a bigger number when we talk about all
All of the
charter
public
schools,
states,
magnet
funded,
Charters, magnets.
all of the other,
Open
charter
choice.
magnets, but they're not gonna be. They're gonna be smaller schools, they're not gonna be large schools.
That's- well, that's
If
right.
that makes sense. The the student population. is-
Well,
I would assume.
Agri-science is small, charter schools are
Well, then,
relatively
if we're
small.
talking about
Magnet
that-
schools have many more students.
Agri-science-
And I don't wanna throw up numbers without having them be actual piece, so
Okay.
that's something else that I'll follow up on.
Great.
So these are agri-science open choice. Open choice is a program that was created prior to the Chef B. O'Neill agreement. And it really is depending on the number of slots that districts are opening up for students. And so this basically shows how the funding flows. I will say that open choice districts cannot charge general education tuition back to the sending district, but they can charge special education. So,
There's some stuff, if you go back to this, because I think, and I say this all the time, like myself and one other director have been here since 2007 when we started doing this. And the interpretation of what special education billing is has changed with new people, and even at the State Department of Education. So where the charter school, the open choice billing, there were guidelines that were given like about really looking at reasonable cost, that the charging of open choice was different than magnet school. And the only reason why is because those kids in open choice were actually counted in the school, the receiving school, as opposed to where in the magnet school, it's kind of like a shared cost. But the interpretation is another one of those things where it's still a big issue of how it's being charged.
at the state level.
And at the district levels, because district level, districts will charge us the same like they charge magnet, and then we explain, but no, this is how it's supposed to be, and it becomes a whole. This is another one of those situations with choice that if there was not this financial consideration, that it would not cause this kind of strain.
I have spoken to some like superintendents on the eastern side of the state where they they won't let their kids exercise choice because it's a general education, it's an added fixed cost to them. And that's even before you get to any billing for special education. So it definitely will stifle choice because there's a new financial responsibility for the sending district, which is too bad. And then this is Resk Magnet School that is operating in the Chef region. They, as I mentioned, they charge tuition, general education, they charge special education. The statute doesn't dictate how much in terms of the percentage of the foundation that they can charge. In terms of general education tuition, there is a statutory cap, but it's based off of expenditures per pupil across the state, and we have some very high spend districts, so essentially, it's not really a cap at all. But there is one statutory cap. And so that's the chef magnet. We do have the next one, non-chef magnets, which are funded differently. Host district magnets with chef, and then host district magnets, non-chef are all funded differently. So these illustrations just, I think, try to show how complex the funding system is. And as I mentioned, this is just general education. This doesn't include special education, but when the state has created different types of public schools along the way, they've created different funding systems for each. And now we have a lot of different programs that are complex. And if somebody were to ask me, how much does the state support my student, I would have to ask them who operates their school, where they attend the school, which is a lot in terms of needing to unpack in order to be able to answer that question in terms of level of state support. So next slide, Rosie. Okay. I forgot that I put this in here. So obviously you have a total budget for the school district. You take out federal and state revenue, and that has to equal your local contribution. And I think everybody around this table understands the dynamics that go on the local side in terms of like getting a budget for the state, or excuse me, for the school district approved. I believe the next slide just talks about how towns need to obviously put together a budget every year. Public schools are the largest expense for every city and town in the state. And obviously all of that needs to come from property taxes on the municipal side. I believe the next slide looks at, the value or the wide discrepancy in value in grand lists. So we have very high wealth districts in terms of the equalized net grand list. And then we have some very property poor communities in terms of taxable property that they can levy to get support for their public school district in their town. So that's a $51 billion difference between our most property wealthy town and our least property wealthy town, which underscores the need for equalization aid, like the education cost sharing grant. The next slide looks at it as on a per capita basis. So as you can see, shouldn't be surprising based off of the last, but this looks at per capita, how much taxable property, our highest and our lowest, and then our state median. As I mentioned before, obviously enrollment's been declining in the state across the past 10 years. However, the needs of our students continue to increase. So while enrollment's going down, the number of students that qualify for free and reduced price lunch and therefore are captured as economically disadvantaged have increased. Our multilingual learners have increased. The students that reside in concentrated poverty has increased. And it's not in the slide deck, but the number of students that receive special education services have also increased. And most of those students are concentrated. We have a paper that I can send to you that looks at the mismatch of student need and resources, and that goes into greater detail about the fact that we have large concentrations of need in our more property poor communities, and just shows it graphically across the state. So I'll share that around as well. Yeah, I think I just touched on that. I did provide this in this PowerPoint. So this shows graphically where per student spending is as compared to the percentage of high need students. And as you can see, we have districts that are relatively lower need that are spending much more per pupil than districts that are trying to educate students, a larger percentage of high need students, and are spending less per student.
We need copies of these. One thing you didn't mention is that the mill rate, the rate at which property is taxed, varies widely from the rich towns, which are very low mill rate towns, to the cities, which are very high mill rate towns.
I mean, yeah, it's a function of having a lot of property wealth. You can have a lower mill rate and generate significantly more sums of money than if you are a lower property wealth town and you need to generate resources to support your schools and otherwise the town operations, and you will have a higher mill rate. We do have a slide that looks at, I believe it's the cost of a $300,000 house and like what property taxes means, or it could be a $20,000 house. But property taxes and, you know, if you happen to live in Waterbury, obviously you're paying a lot more in property taxes than if you pick up your house and move to like New Fairfield or New
Yeah,
York.
that's 11,380 to Danbury, which is 4,800.
I love that you have that up.
Because I was looking at my,
Yeah, I know.
I don't think you should. Read it to 2,300.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously where you live and where you go to school, 100%.
Why don't they give I don't know. No, because I worry about Danbury. Danbury's got the least people, and then it says if you know, as a Danbury resident, they don't increase taxes, and that screws up this all of this as well, so, as a taxpayer.
Yeah, and the ECS formula takes the total cost and splits it state local, but there's no enforcement that the local makes up their share. So there are districts that are considered that they underfund their share of ECS or what's required for K-12 education in their district. Which is unfortunate because if you have this formula and it's setting up state local, I mean, I'm sure that like Bridgeport's one of those towns and Bridgeport will probably say we don't have the taxing capacity to levy an additional $20 million. So therefore adjustments need to be made to the ECS formula so that the state is picking up a larger share. And I think that that would be a valid argument, but I will say similar to the weights, the breakdown of property taxes versus median household income in that formula, those are arbitrary numbers. And prior to the new formula, it was just property wealth that was taken into consideration. Having it now split with some property wealth and income in terms of median household income, I think increased equity. But those are all also arbitrary numbers that are, one can argue for them not being an appropriate number.
Lisa?
Yeah.
Do you know, this connects this to an earlier slide, how the state collects the data in terms of, I mean, special ed, yes, but like the free or reduced receiving students, do they do it by collecting? I know they do a information gathering from the schools at the beginning of the year in like October. Is it based off SACID numbers or is it based off self-reporting? Do you know where they get their calculations from? Is it hard data that the schools entered into whatever system they're using, or is it self-reported?
It's self-reported.
So they don't use like SACID attached to free reduced or 504 or special ed or anything like that?
I think most districts, for like economically disadvantaged and therefore qualifying for free or reduced price lunch, when you have the community eligibility provision, right, with free lunches for districts, I think that some districts are looking to get what they view as a more accurate number through like direct certification and working with the Department of Social Services, but I think it varies by town, Jason.
Okay.
And I think it is self-reported. For an example, we were talking to the Bridgeport superintendent before he moved over to Fairfield, and we were looking at the data that Bridgeport provided for the number of kids that qualified for free reduced price lunch, and it was low. Like, you would look at that data point and you we questioned it as being maybe not an accurate count of kids because of the community eligibility provision. I don't think that districts understand that they need to have an accurate count on all of these things because it will impact your resources. And so year after year, Bridgeport did a much more intentional count, and they increased their state support by $5 million just by having
Yeah.
just by having a more accurate count, because they went from a low and they went up to where you would think that they would be. And so, you know, for districts, they need to understand that with a formula in place that takes into account student need, you need to do as good of a job as you can in trying to capture the need of your student population.
That
I mean, I
capture
think,
need requires individual applications and proof of eligibility though, I think, right?
Not in the community.
yeah, I think if you qualify for Husky, they sometimes will report that and automatically. It's a bad system, but so it's just attached to an idea I'll throw at you at least at the very end because it's too crazy to talk about beforehand. But if there was a way for the state to follow a student who's nameless, right? They're just a SACID number. That might make things easier in terms of funding schools because kids move. And that's one of the, from a Board of Ed standpoint, or I sit on the Clinton Board of Ed, that's the fear, is that by doing right by the kids, suddenly you have $1 million student come into district, and that wasn't there the previous year, they were somewhere else. But if the state knew that number came with a specific amount of funding, perhaps there could be more live streaming of money. But I'll throw that out at the very end.
I mean, I think that's a good question for the State Department of Education. Because, you know, we just take data that they have compiled. I don't know if there could be changes in their data process to get at what you're asking about, Jason.
Well, now that we have CT SENS, right, that's supposed to be part of the purpose, right, is so that the state has access to that data constantly.
Well, and, you know, Jason's has a sort of a germ of a proposal there that we really ought to flesh out and, you know, sort of run by a bunch of people to see whether it makes sense about attaching these attributes to the SACID number of a student. Yeah, I don't know, you know, it sounds like it makes sense, but it also sounds like it could be a tremendous burden.
Rosie, I'm not sure. I think we're at the tail end, are we? Oh, okay. So inclusion of a special education weight. So adding a weight, as I mentioned, would simply be additive to the ECS formula. It would be in addition to all the other weights that are currently included in the ECS formula, and it would provide state support for special education services prior to getting up to that 4.5 times per pupil expenditure threshold. And I believe the next slide just provides our estimate in terms of total cost. So when the ECS grant is fully funded, if the state includes a 25% weight, similar to what the weight is for our multilingual learners, the total estimated cost of the state is approximately $77 million. And it would be provided through the ECS formula and would vary depending on the district and the number of students within each district, but then also it would vary depending upon the ECS formula overall and how much the state picks up in terms of total expenses compared to the local government. And that's it. So I hope that this was helpful. I have a number of things.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And so if you have any additional questions, obviously I can see if I have answers, but I can also add it to the list and follow up with the task force.
Well, somehow we have to take this and turn it into specific recommendations with some backup and some cost data on it. And the things I'm hearing are the special ed weight, obviously, is one of them. Is obviously sentiment. I don't necessarily agree with full funding or excess costs. That's come here. There's been the proposal that we've heard from Tiffany about the state funding special ed costs at choice schools, which would be another type of proposal. And then there's the related sort of proposal that Jason made about attaching these special characteristics to the SASA numbers of students. I don't know whether I got everything that's on the
Also
table.
about like specialized, maybe some sort of funding for specialized programming in district.
That's the fifth one, a grant program to allow on a multi-year basis for the development of capacity in districts. I think, we've got to reduce each of those to a specific, sort of proposal, cost it out, look at other justifications for it, and see whether it's something we want to go with as final proposals.
Ask a
And-
question. Oh,
Sorry, Jason, your question's probably much better than mine. You go first.
I very much doubt that, but I am louder than you. So my question is for the numbers that were given at the beginning for the sort of the reimbursement rates in terms of tuition and et cetera, et cetera. Are those static numbers, Lisa? Do you know? Are they are they inflation adjusted each year? Because at the very minimum, we know that money is more expensive every year. Does it make sense? Money is more expensive each year. But like if those are static numbers and have been so, then at the very minimum, there's got to be a proposal on the table saying this has to be inflation adjusted, and at least then it's somewhat keeping pace with the costs that are facing school districts.
Fixing the foundation, I think is what Jason's talking about.
Well, yeah, but this is a special ed task force. Fixing the foundation is a general education sort of issue, it seems to me.
Not if we include the special ed costs in it.
It's part of it.
To the extent that the state contends that 20 to 25% of the ECS foundation is attributable to special education costs, then I think that sort of brings it within the ambit of the task force.
Of course, the 25% is based on the notion that about 12.5% of kids were eligible for special education, and they cost twice as much as other kids. And that's taking us to 25%. And now that we're up to 17% eligible, that number probably should be more like 34%.
Jason, I literally was going to say kind of what you said, but I was actually going to tell Andy he was brilliant because as everyone was talking, I was kind of writing down what our findings or proposals would be, and Andy hit every single one like off the top of his head. But the one extra one was the possibility of the academic research to adjust what ECG should be, and we can say with special education, because that was a recommendation that we actually need that data, and I know legislators need that data.
So do I understand correctly that there is a finance subcommittee of the task force? And who is on that?
And Mike wrote.
Yeah.
And Jason, I believe.
Do whatever I have to do. I'm sure I am.
And our initial work was to work on coming up with the findings
Right.
in that area.
So Lisa, Patrice, Jason,
Stephanie.
And can I throw out that really crazy idea I shared with you a few months ago, just to have it on the table?
Which one of your crazy ideas, Jason?
That's a good point. This was a crazy idea of the state taking control of outplacements as their fiscal duty. And so any sort of appeals after the district needed it would be handled legally by the state. And then any outplacements would be handled by the state. So they could be like the BJs of, obviously I'm not being very articulate here, but they could negotiate down the prices that seem to be going up at even worse than a college tuition rate.
Buying it
It
in
was
bulk.
just an idea.
Well, one of the things that I think we've talked about a couple of times is that I think, and this is going to bring me back to a question that I think was asked earlier on in Lisa's presentation about other state funding formulas, and should we be looking at the possibility of adopting a different formula that isn't on the table rather than tinkering around with what we're doing right now. I'm interested in knowing whether there is, and Jason, this is going to your point. I think I know that there are other neighboring states that do take full funding responsibility when there is a recommendation for a residential placement, for example. So I'm wondering whether, do we want to delegate to the finance subcommittee the task of fleshing out some of these proposals, including looking at whether or not there's something that other states are doing that we should be looking at.
I was wondering, maybe as a step in between that maybe there's something that we review tuition cost, like even with RESC and things of that sort, like how people are charging tuition. Because I'll give you, for instance, I'm not gonna tell you who, but one particular, well, I can't say, but anyway, it's gone up like 11%. Every year, tuition, every year out of district tuition has gone up significantly. And I'm just wondering if you take a look at that and how folks are being charged for tuition based off of the cost they have to run programs.
Well, and I
Whether
think
the state
that,
is absorbing that, but there has to be something, because that's, again, even with excess costs, even if it gets that threshold, you're never recouping the amount of funds that you actually need in district. And I think that number continues to go up. Like, for instance, we had one particular place, at one point was like 134 kids. And over 3 years, the tuition cost went up $2.8 million with the same amount of kids.
I think that sort of fits my thought process around looking at what other states are doing,
Right.
for example, because I believe that there are other states that also set
Oh.
funding
okay.
caps.
Oh.
Or per diem
Oh.
rates for outplacement.
Well, as Karen and I were just talking about, Massachusetts sets rates for each private school, but the comparable programs are substantially higher in Massachusetts cost than they are in Connecticut. So I'm not, and setting rates involves a huge state bureaucracy of auditors and all that sort of thing. And so, I'm not sure that state rate setting is necessarily any answer there.
Like how much higher? That's like what's an average?
I didn't know either.
I mean, it's hard to compare the same
But
program.
you're,
to program.
I'm just saying like, you're saying it's increasing, that the rate setting is increasing the bill.
You just look at programs that I know are similar to the Connecticut program, and just the approved rate is just that much higher. I don't know why that is.
Well, if that ends up being the recommendation, that it wouldn't make sense fiscally because the rates would end up being higher here. I think that's something that can come back from that inquiry. But I do think that it's skewed a little bit by the number of residential placements, for example, that exist in Massachusetts versus Connecticut. We have a relatively low number of schools that fit that description.
That's true. So let's talk process here. Are we asking Patrice's subcommittee to refine and flesh out these recommendations and come back to us with what we can move forward with?
Sounded that way to me.
Well,
but-
I'm thinking about that, trying to take advantage of the existing subcommittee structures and knowing that we have a limited amount of time here. And, for all intents and purposes, we have like 4 meetings of the larger group before we're expected to make recommendations to the legislature. So.
And besides, there's only 3 members of the finance committee here and many others, we can't have voted.
I will share what I will share in the finance committee is that I think that just personally recommending a complete overhaul in how the state distributes its K-12 resources would just fall flat. Just my own personal opinion of working with the General Assembly is that I think the fact that they enacted a formula that they followed in 2019, started using, was a tremendous step forward from how this.
Oh, and don't misunderstand, I'm not suggesting a complete overhaul of how we fund education generally in Connecticut.
Okay.
I'm focused on the first statement, I think that we focused on around the fact that the only funding that we have in the state is excess cost reimbursement, right? And that's an outlier as it pertains to other states. And so, that's where I would like to look at, what are other states doing differently? And can we make an argument for why something like that should be adopted here in Connecticut?
That we could do. I had the impression that you were thinking about analyzing like the overall funding structure, which is fine. I mean,
You
I
can
like
change your panic very well.
policy work.
Already done that.
You can change your panic grid.
I hope that whatever this task force comes out with, that it's possible, like I want things to be implemented and to actually change in the funding system. And I'm not saying don't be kind. I love saying kind, and I think that it's good policy, but if the original ask was to unpack, which it's not, then I would be like, oh my God.
No.
Beyond our scope.
Yeah, so, we did estimate a foundation adjustment just as an FYI, and we use the state's funding or inflator that it uses for the spending cap, which is something that the state, has used in the past in terms of inflating expenditures. And the estimated cost for a foundation adjustment is $177 million in the first year. So once you get out just a number of years, so how many years? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years out, the total state cost is $795 million. So that inflation adjuster provides a significant increase in state support that is much larger than even the inclusion of a special education aid. And these costs are going up anyway, they're just paid for by the local government.
Right.
So it's either property taxes or it's state resources via revenue streams that are not as progressive.
Okay, I'd like to move off finance and talk about process for other subcommittees.
Yeah, give other people some work.
Is the subcommittee willing to take on that task?
I think we'll, as the person that was responsible for convening the subcommittee, we'll do our best. Especially with Lisa's help.
Is it okay also to reach out to my folks at AFT to see if they have some, some states that they would recommend to look at?
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
I'm not going to say you have to do this, but at least it's an idea.
Well, the Council of State Legislators on their website has this wonderful chart of how special ed is funded in each of the states. It's incredibly complicated to look at, but it's there. And what we don't know, what we don't even have a metrics for is, outcome measures. Is what's producing a better result. So Alicia, where are you in terms of moving from findings to recommendations in terms of your eligibility or your services?
Services, and we have not had any meetings since our final meeting at the end of last year. So there was one meeting in between that I missed, but we haven't made any shifts into recommendations.
Is that something you could do?
Our committee?
Yes.
Yes, we can move into recommendations. We may need to get together and kind of recalibrate on where we left off with the findings, and of the findings, if we have any questions from the committee in terms of moving forward. But yes, absolutely. Yep.
And can you just refresh my recollection as to which services, what was the focus of the services subcommittee?
Services was focused on, I would say, looking at service delivery. So part of what we looked at was things like we had the impact of artificial intelligence, for example. Like, one of our findings was that could have an impact on special education services. So a recommendation might be that we look further into what is the potential impact of AI and how can it be beneficial not only for differentiation of students, but productivity, things like writing IEP goals and things like that. I don't know, Karen or Heather, if you can think off the top of your head, I can pull it up. in terms of what other things we had in our, findings.
I think we did universal pre-K.
Universal pre-K, looking at MTSS,
And what was that?
looking at
Yeah.
MTSS,
We talked about,
effective AI
the-
and special education.
yeah, we talked about para educators and, supporting them and looking at them in terms of potential pipeline to increasing, those who are certified for special education.
And the
I
big
think
area was
there's
staff
one
shortages.
more.
Staff shortages is the biggest area there. And
What did you say?
Staff shortages.
Yes, we know.
And that's an area that, you know, I think we've got to make recommendations in that area.
Right, that was
And we
identified.
talked about how there's a committee, there is a state task force working in that area, so whether it's something that we, I don't know, kind of co-collaborate on, or also make recommendations in parallel, we can talk about that too.
Well, we had talked about the possibility of doing a meeting, I think next month, where we're inviting sort of testimony from special educators and para educators on the subject of why there are staff shortages, why we're not attracting people into the profession, why people are leaving the profession. So are we still planning to do that?
Well, we still have the meeting scheduled for next month.
We'll need to get information. I don't know if we've already got information out to people, but I would think we would need to get information out
Right.
relatively soon.
Yeah, I'm sorry Brian's not here today. He's got the whole list and he sent that out. And the other area that we have to cover is gifted and talented. If the legislature told us we have. to
Is
cover
which
it.
one?
Gifted and talented.
Oh.
I think eligibility took that on. Amy, is Amy on?
No, I don't think so.
The eligibility was in the do gifted and talented.
I thought we brought that last time, the 2 times ago, we brought a huge piece of that, the document. I've been looking through it.
Alicia, could you invite me? I know I'm not on your committee, but the SAC had met with Representative Curry concerning teacher shortage, and he was really interested in the grow your own model that Tennessee was doing and looking at that model. And maybe I could share that with your group. And then the SAC is also talking about the state seal of biliteracy and how that can encourage students that are bilingual to become special education teachers.
Can I just say something? Because as far as staff shortage, the state, there's actually a lot of grow your own programs right now that people are accessing through the residency and even through alternative route for certification. What I think is a larger issue outside of just a grow your own is really the requirements for certification. And really, how do we lack some of the requirements for certification enough to provide more access? Because I think the state is moving in a direction of doing a lot more grow your own. There are districts who are doing that. We have several in our own district of grow our own programs with paraeducators and pipelines. But I think where you see in the roadblock is really kind of the certification.
Well, and that is that whole separate legislation that passed this year about certification.
Yeah, that's what I was just gonna say. We've just seen that come through, so maybe that's something that we need to kind of digest as a committee,
Right.
but I wonder if are we duplicating efforts? And not saying that's a bad thing, but I know many of our organizations are on a committee that's looking at shortage, certification, all of these things. So I think we should decide as a committee, do we want to do that in parallel, in conjunction with, or focus our energy elsewhere in this short amount of time that we have?
Yeah, I just think there's work that's being done on staff shortage right now.
Well, but the certification commission
Yep.
established has had nothing to say whatever about special education. Nothing. The entire report void of that intentionally. And moreover, the staff shortages are far more acute in special education than in general education, and even more acute in the paraeducator.
But I think there's other factors.
Not doing it.
Well, I think that planning where we're talking about and actually getting the voices of people who are in the profession, because I will be honest with you, when you're hearing those things, it's not even just about grow your own or certification, like even just maintaining and retaining the folks. So maybe that's a part of that.
I think
And
that's right.
maybe Andy, to your point, if there are some things in having a voice within certification, how do we get that voice around special education? But there's other variables that impact people that we need to hear their voices too.
And Andrew, do you know why it was intentionally left out? Like you're saying? Was there a reason for that?
Because there was plenty of work to be done in terms of general education teachers, is what the answer was.
Because, sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Because there was plenty of work to be done in terms of general education certification.
Do you know if it's something that they're intending on that, because that committee or task force, their work is not done?
You know, I've had lots of conversations with people involved in that, and there doesn't seem to be a great deal of interest in that.
Really?
That's like kind of shocking.
That's, we can, you're on that, right?
I am, but we haven't met, they're waiting to hire a staff person to provide support. So I wouldn't say that anything is off the table, because
Right.
as a body, we haven't defined our work.
Yeah, but you look at the legislation, which was really extensive on that, and the legislation doesn't talk about special ed. I mean, I don't think they're precluded from looking at it, but I'd be surprised if there's any substantial focus on it. And as I said before, the staff shortage in special education is really acute, and that's something that we certainly have jurisdiction to look at.
Well, it was identified in the findings report as a primary issue. It was also identified by the sort of informal survey that we sent out before we started meeting in this session as a priority for folks around this table, and the stakeholders. So I'm a little uncomfortable with not addressing it in any way. I do think it's important for us to hear from teachers and para educators. We talked a lot about that at the last meeting. If there's a need for coordination with another committee or task force or group of stakeholders that's also working in the same area, maybe we can coordinate efforts and kind of join forces on that. But since it's in the report of findings, I think we need to kind of strike while the iron is hot and make a recommendation around that issue. So I'd like to move forward with the plan that we had at the last meeting on that.
I would agree.
Now, who was eligibility task force? We just did services.
It was myself,
Alicia, don't forget I'm on your.
Susan,
Jennifer.
I think I'm on that team too.
Yeah, you are too.
I
You're
know.
on with Alicia too in services. You only have one. meeting.
Who was chairing that committee?
is it Amy?
I told them I can't meet.
Who was the chair? Susan, was it Amy? Not Amy. It's Amy.
Yeah, it's Amy.
And we haven't met, since I think we all got we went for the findings.
Well, again, it would be helpful if each of the subcommittees could come up with a list of some recommendations, which we could then talk about in the whole group, and then decide on how we're going to do the sort of legwork to make those recommendations acceptable, saleable.
Is there additional work, I guess, that needs to be done by the larger group around any of the issues that were covered by the eligibility subcommittee?
We did, I'm just going through, we did identification, we didn't find that there was an over identification of student disabilities.
Said there was
There
not,
was not.
even
With
disproportionately,
There was, I mean, that's.
by children of color,
I'm looking quickly,
because I think.
because you can read through what we
Yeah,
found.
I just think that maybe look at that by children of color and you're gonna find something.
Well, I'm sure we had a discussion, I'm just telling you what. we went
But even,
through.
even with the eligibility, even if it's not disproportionate, the increase is problematic.
We had age limit for developmental delay category,
Right.
behavior.
And the increase in special ed identification in our state.
And those are the three big parts of that.
And we had and then some recommendations that we had made were not in the report. So they were put in and then they kind of disappeared. So I guess we could go over that.
Okay. Well, let's.
We would need Amy though, because Amy's the chair.
Can you
Yeah.
please make sure to breaking it out by subgroups too of children of color and looking at disproportionality, because I think it's a huge piece of it. And I think there's also, and looking at our eligibility and percentage of special education compared to other states.
Tiffany, do you want, when Amy sends out an invite, do you want her to include you in case you have time to come talk about that?
Sure. I'm just
Okay.
saying, you're gonna hear me talk about that all the time.
Right, but I think that would be wonderful if we could
Sure.
have your perspective.
Are you going to communicate, Susan, are you going to?
Yeah, I'll send Amy an email right after this and ask her to set something up. And, okay,
And I think what we want to do is not do this for the September meeting, but do this for the October meeting, so that we have the benefit of those field hearings.
Right, and are those, can I ask, are those listening sessions, have the times and dates been confirmed? I saw the list of
No,
dates,
I
but
don't think so.
variety
And
of times.
I think Michelle, Fran, and I have to get with Brian and just confirm all that.
This is the
Okay.
meeting with the rest.
I think
Yes.
mine have been confirmed.
Yeah,
Huh?
they
I
were,
think he picked, because
Right.
people didn't have,
You pick times?
I think he picked the time.
I thought that was our sort of directive to him.
Yeah,
as,
but,
you know,
But do we know the times? 'Cause we're-
No.
Yeah, we gotta put out an email.
I can tell you the time.
Oh,
Well, let's do it by email.
That's fine. Like I said to the rest, release. the rest.
But if we could create a flyer or something that we could share beyond what's sent to supers or directors, that would probably be good to get the word out as soon as possible.
Now, Tiffany, you had
Offered to have something in district.
offered, maybe the wrong verb, but yes.
Oh, it wasn't offered, highly suggested, advocated for,
Commanded.
the commanded, okay, I'll take that. I'm just saying that there's a different population of students, and I was trying to get this, but I think what the last time when I was in the meeting, what was talked about was there's supposed to be certain facilitators and training, what have you. I know that I am going to be having something for some parents on August 26th coming back. We want to try to have some convening with some parents, and even that is not going to get all of our parents, but at least it's something to give more access.
Well, I mean, my thought was that we should tell Brian,
Yep.
coordinate with you,
That's fine.
a session in New Haven
That would be
with
great.
facilitators in the same drill.
That's fine.
Okay, is that all right with you, Michelle?
Yeah, there was the discussion at the last meeting, I think, was that there was a need for or a desire for uniformity in the way that the report of findings was presented to the public when it's presented. So we were sort of discouraged from establishing our own informal discussion groups on this because they wanted to, you know, sort of do it the same way every time. So I think that would be, you know, something to ask Brian to come in and do one in New Haven specifically.
Can I just clarify expectations for the next step? So for our subcommittees, should we be taking our findings report that we submitted and build recommendations based on those agreed upon findings? And then in addition to that, when we have our data through these focus groups and feedback, if there are things that are in addition to that or different, we will attend to those as well. I just want to be clear that we're not, and if we are, I'm not aware of what they are, any new things that I missed one meeting only and I feel like I missed so much. So are there new things or new expectations on, for example, the services subcommittee different from what we previously submitted in our findings report that we should be paying attention to?
Good question. The answer is yes, that you should be developing recommendations from the finding report. But
Okay.
also at the last meeting, Chairman Curry came and said, you guys got to cover all the major issues in special ed, even if you don't have
Okay.
agreement. And so if there are other issues that we really need to address, raise them, and then we can decide as a larger group whether it's something we want to pursue or not.
So
Well,
I
I
have to say, I heard his instructions to us a little bit differently, and it may be because I missed the whole first part of
That's okay.
this task force. So, but I heard that as when you issue your recommendations, which will be based on the report of findings,
Yes.
you don't have consensus as to your recommendations, then tell us what the arguments are on both sides, all sides, so that we, the legislature, can decide which direction we want to go in. And we might adopt one party's view versus another and run with it. I did not hear that as an invitation to this group to expand beyond the report of findings and address additional issues. And
Okay.
I said this to Andy, I am very concerned, not that I don't want to address additional issues, and I think there are additional issues, but I'm just concerned about the amount of time that we have.
Yes.
And the 4 months essentially that we
Yeah.
have to try to reach consensus on the 13, I think it's 13 issues in the report of findings, and to draft a report of recommendations to put on the desk of the legislature in January.
I would,
That's my concern. I'm worried that this is my anxiety about missing this deadline if we start to expand our mandate beyond those 13 issues.
I would agree. It took us a very long time to get to those 13 issues and a lot of roundabout conversation because there's so much that we could be talking about. And so I like the idea of staying focused on our findings that we presented. And if our recommendations need to incorporate different perspectives, that makes sense. So we stay the course on the findings, and if through, for example, these focus groups or things like that, we have different perspectives that can inform our recommendations or different ways to approach the finding, but it's not going to take us off course as to a new finding. We're trying to stay tied to, or we should stay tied to what it is that we already have found.
Focus on the findings, recommendations.
Correct.
Findings, and do that well.
That's
Yes.
my
And if
interpretation.
there needs to be another task force, you know.
Yeah, if you finish early, feel free to work on extra credit projects.
I have a quick question. I have my notes from our meeting with Representative Curry, and I have a star next to the word enforcement because he kept bringing that up to us. And is that something we need to address? Because I know that was just addressed with the excess cost grant. Like, is there any enforcement if they don't? The state?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say he's conveyed that he's very concerned with, I mean, he said this on numerous occasions, very concerned with the enforcement mechanism of the State Department of Education and then the oversight and the monitoring of some of these things. I mean, Andy, you would know more about what he said on those items, but that is something that I think he's very interested in.
I agree, it's something he's very interested in. I'm also at a loss as to, recommendations about that.
Yeah,
I mean, clearly
what does that?
the department does not do a good job of enforcing mandates, but they don't have the staff to do it. And so, as I said to another legislator yesterday, the fault lies with you guys, not with the Department of Education. If you wanted to fund it, you fund it and give them the direction to do so. And so, I think that, so I agree that's that the decreasing influence of the Department of Education is a serious concern. But that said, I'm not sure that's something we can address.
I mean, I'm answering what she said, which is star enforcement.
Yeah,
That's-
no, I agree.
that's what
Jeff
he
is very interested. No doubt about that.
Is it possible for each of the subcommittees, as you review your findings and move towards recommendations, to keep enforcement in mind in terms of making recommendations? And if there is a mechanism for enforcement that could be recommended relative to one of those items,
Yeah,
it could be worked into your recommendation.
by issue area.
Well,
Yeah.
and the other piece of that, of course, is that most of what the Department of Education does is issue guidance. And I suppose a recommendation could be that instead of guidance on a certain area, there could be a mandate on that area. But that's up, we certainly won't fund it.
No,
No.
I don't want to interrupt, but one of our I'm sure many watchers / listeners right now wrote me saying that the representative is not running for office any longer, but that matters. But
That's why
I think it's probably good to know.
Yeah,
I have a logistics
Well,
question.
yes, let's take the logistics.
So our next meeting is when we're gonna be inviting people in, and how does that?
Well, no, we have a September meeting scheduled.
Right,
I don't
remind us
know.
of the date.
is that the date that we're supposed to be inviting in teachers and paraeducators?
No, those are the
Right.
meetings at the rest.
Okay, so then my follow-up.
Okay, no, we
No.
talked at the last meeting. I thought, again, I can be corrected, but I thought we talked at the last meeting about having teachers and paraeducators being invited.
Yes.
And the CEA and AFT specifically were going to reach out to their membership about inviting people to provide comments to us during that next meeting. And we also were somewhat concerned about the fact that the date of the next meeting is like the day after the
Tuesday
Labor
after Labor
Day
Day.
weekend.
Yeah.
And we thought we might move it potentially to the following Tuesday and maybe even in the afternoon so that we could allow for teachers and paraeducators time after school hours to participate if necessary.
That's my recollection as well. And the morning of that Tuesday, September 10th, is the commissioner's back to school gathering.
So
which
we don't want to
involves many of
conflict
us.
with that, right? So what do we think of that plan? Do we want to shoot for the afternoon of September 10th?
What time do you want to convene?
I think we were talking about like 4 o'clock meeting so that it would be after school hours and there would be time for people to either get here or get to a place where they could participate virtually.
I think we, yeah, I was gonna be.
Where's the,
Up in, Harvard, just across from, or from the, Capitol.
was there parking?
Yeah, we have a whole parking.
Is there a way to do it also virtually?
Oh, yeah, no.
Because, well, my understanding was when I was asked, how many people, we didn't have a specific number. We didn't go 6 people,
Right.
right? That's what, because that's what I was hearing, like, oh, can you find 6 people? I'm like, I don't think we just want 6 people. We want more of a group of people that can speak to those, what we want. It was about, retention, right, and recruiting, that whole idea.
Okay, so,
And I also wanted to advocate that you invite people from approved privates, just to say look at the different population and rest.
21 Oak Street.
okay, so it's 4 o'clock at CEA headquarters on the 10th of September.
I'll double check.
That's what I'm.
And so how are we inviting? People? Did you all have a mechanism for how you're gonna be doing that?
Well, we were clarifying on how many people, because, and I know Jason has more of the, parents, because we do not have them in our union. So ours would be certified teachers.
Okay.
But when I had heard, it was like, can you find 6 people? And I was like, I think that's what we discussed.
I don't remember putting a number on it. I think it was
I
just
got
a
an email,
general
so I don't
invitation
remember.
to the membership. I do think that there was an exchange about the para educator of the year being invited, and I think she got a specific invitation sent to her, if I'm not mistaken.
So Dawn DeCow is on the SAC, but I didn't invite to anything because I didn't know what I was inviting her to. I didn't know if it was the general meetings that we were having. So, and I think, yeah, and if it's gonna be at CEA, maybe we should have an RSVP because isn't there limited space?
So I think we can fit 70 people in our room. And then we have a virtual option as well.
And then I think we have to just think about the structure, like who's facilitating it, what.
I actually won't be able to be here. So if we moved it to the 10th, the 3rd, I have the 3rd scheduled, so.
Right, I mean, that's very important if you know,
Stephanie.
if we're not, if we're having more than 6
Right,
teachers and parents.
Right, how does that all manage?
We want to, I mean, do we give everybody 3 minutes to do that, or do we?
Or have them work in small tables, have them do a small discussion and share out, like there's ways to facilitate.
I think we need to, Ryan, maybe.
This is very CERC. Oh, I feel like this is in the wheelhouse of CERC and it gets too late to get them involved, but they are the facilitator experts.
Do we have any sense of how many people might respond to the invitation if they were invited to come and speak on this issue? I was sort of envisioning that it would just be our regular meeting, except that, people who want to provide input to the task force would be invited to have a few minutes to speak to the issue. That's what I was envisioning. I was not envisioning sort of a CERC facilitated event. But if we think that we're gonna get.
Or a legislative hearing that could go on all night
Right.
if we.
That's a
did.
lot.
I thought it was like a panel discussion.
Right.
We have about people on CEA, especially task force with myself. There's like 25 and it keeps growing because it's such a big thing, special ed, right? Everything is it's the IDA, 50th year, and everything is like, there's other committees meeting right now on this same subject and we're not there, right? So there's so many people talking about this right now. But we could probably get a good amount of them that are in this area too. Because, they'll come to meetings, but they'll come online as well.
Yeah, I mean, if we wanna, if we're thinking about like a dozen, right, that come, then I think we would need to be more targeted in our invites, get a couple from the rest, a couple from our group privates, versus are we thinking about a CERF-related event that does require a lot more. Yeah, I'm not saying I want that, I just, the way you're discussing is like, what is that? Right, when we start talking about a lot of people, then that's how we're gonna manage that, who's gonna facilitate.
And the following week, the events at each RESC or wherever we decide to hold them are starting.
Right.
So those are all pretty much concentrated in the third and fourth week of September.
So those are open to anybody, right?
Those are open to anybody who can come. They have 50 people capacity, and then there'll be 3 virtual sessions.
So I wasn't envisioning something on that scale at all. I'm starting to wonder if we even need to move it to the CEA headquarters, or if we just sort of, have it here as usual and it just in the afternoons to accommodate people's schedules.
I'm not inclined to have, dozens of teachers all wanting to speak.
Right.
I don't know how productive that would be.
Well, especially if we already have that organized.
So many other opportunities.
Right.
But a smaller group of sort of
Targeted.
representative of special education teachers and parents.
And we should also get directors too. I mean, I think there's another group of people that there's already existing groups that maybe we can feed into.
And I apologize, but I have to facilitate webinar.
Thank you. I really sure they can.
Yeah. Well,
So what do you want to do here? What do we want?
what we want is that Michelle, Fran, and I would get together and discuss this and put out something.
I would just want to raise another issue too for those September meetings. Those are based on the findings, which are not still really, right.
That's
So
a
I
big
mean,
issue.
right, that's a big issue.
I think you have to tell.
That's a good.
Better we got it. What do we need for local reason?
Yeah, we got it.
When's Jeff done?
Waiting for-
When's Jeff
But
done?
can I ask a question?
I'm
Sorry, leave Jeff done.
Why
No,
are
he
we
would
waiting
finish
for a
his
press
term,
conference
but
to
he is-
release the findings?
Because we're instructed to do so.
Can I ask a question too, just back to, Terry's point about looking at the different arguments? I'm just wondering, how does that get presented out there as well, right? Just like we were just going back and forth over this notion of eligibility, and we see this differently. How do we reconcile that, right? Because if we have one finding saying that, eligibility is not a problem, and that's not something, and I'll be honest with you, I would be very vocal that that's not true. I just wonder, how do we reconcile that out?
I think the process is going to be that we're going to try to reach consensus on the final report. To the
Okay,
extent we don't reach consensus, I think people are invited to have concurrent and dissenting views.
okay.
I think he just kept saying he really wants it all included, because I think well, now, not he, but whoever, the committee can't act on something that's not in there even, they're gonna choose a side, I guess, if the legislature chooses by side, But they're gonna make a position, and they want it to have something to jump off from. That's kind of what I got. I think he's very interested in the areas where there is not consensus. That's probably a good way to say it.
Yeah.
Can I just clarify one more thing from the screen? I'm anticipating that it's gonna be hard to get the services committee together between now and September 10th. But we're saying between now and our October meeting, it's essential that we meet at least once. We might be able even to do twice, but it's not expected that we do something because that meeting already has an agenda, correct?
Correct.
Correct.
Okay, great, got it.
Okay, I think we've concluded the agenda. I think we can adjourn. And thank you, Lisa.
Oh, you're welcome.
That was very-
Yeah, now completely clear.
Like, I can do this myself. Like, there, well, Katie called me yesterday, I was like, okay.
No, I just changed my.
No.
computer back there.
Are we on?
Yeah, yeah.
This was a little more.